I'd been refreshing the rental listings for hours when the ad appeared. Spare room available. Quiet neighborhood. Month to month. No pets. There was no photo of the landlord. Just one of a modest townhouse with white shutters and ivy creeping up the front porch. It looked ordinary. Safe. Affordable. That word, affordable, had become my new religion. After losing my part-time job at the coffee shop and breaking up with my boyfriend in the same week, I was living off savings that barely covered groceries. I'd spent nights counting bills under dim kitchen light, wondering what went wrong. How someone could love you 1 month and say you deserve more stability the next. By the time I packed my last box, even my apartment felt like it was giving up on me. So I emailed about the room. Within an hour, a reply came back. You can come by this evening if you'd like to see it. 7 p.m. Elias. No emojis, no punctuation beyond what was necessary. Straightforward. I liked that. The neighborhood was quiet. Almost too quiet for someone who'd grown used to sirens and late-night laughter from the bars near campus. The sun was dipping low when I walked up the narrow path, shoes crunching on gravel. I clutched my backpack like it held all the proof that I still belonged somewhere. The door opened before I could knock twice. He stood there, mid-30s maybe, tall, dark hair that fell slightly into his eyes, and a kind of stillness about him that made noise feel unnecessary. His expression didn't say welcome exactly, but it didn't say go away either. You must be... He paused, waiting for me to fill in the blank. Jamie. My voice came out small. About the room? He nodded once. Come in. The house smelled faintly of cedar and something older. Maybe dust, maybe memory. The entryway was neat, masculine. Dark wooden floors, gray walls, no clutter. Everything seemed placed with intention. Pair of boots by the door. A single coat hanging on a hook. No trace of anyone else living there. I followed him into the living room. A bookshelf lined one wall, full of worn paperbacks, some military memoirs, others poetry. On the mantel sat a few framed photos. A lake, a dog, a woman with a tired smile. The last one looked like it hadn't been dusted in a while, and I noticed Elias's eyes flick toward it briefly before turning back to me. The room's upstairs, he said. His voice was low, controlled. Second door on the right. As we climbed, I caught details. The faint creak in the third step, a painting of a winter forest, the faint hum of an old refrigerator downstairs. He moved quietly, as if not to disturb something invisible in the air. The spare room was small but bright. One window facing the street, a twin bed, a simple desk, a small dresser. A radiator hissed softly in the corner. It was nothing fancy, but after weeks of anxiety and boxes, it looked like sanctuary. I can pay the first month in cash, I said quickly, afraid he'd change his mind. I just need a little time to get back on my feet. I'm looking for work again. He studied me, not judging, just observing. You're in school. Graduated last spring. English major. I laughed weakly. Turns out that's not a golden ticket to employment. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. I could have told you that. There was silence again, but not an uncomfortable kind. More like a shared understanding of what it felt like to have life humiliate you in small, practical ways. We discussed rent. It was fair, almost too fair for the size and location. Utilities included no deposit. He mentioned house rules. Quiet after 10, no smoking, no parties. His tone wasn't stern, just factual. When we returned downstairs, he gestured toward a door at the end of the hallway. That's my room. Bathroom's next to it. Kitchen's free to use. Just clean up after yourself. He didn't open his bedroom door, and something about that struck me. Maybe because every other part of the house felt open and tidy, that one closed door stood out like a secret. I'll take it, I said. His brows lifted slightly. You don't want to think about it? No need. Feels right. All right then. I signed a short handwritten lease at the dining table while he watched from across. Arms crossed loosely, posture calm but unreadable. The whole thing felt strangely intimate, like we'd both agreed to something bigger than a rental contract. I moved in that same evening. The few boxes I had stacked neatly against the wall looked almost childish compared to the room's neat simplicity. I unpacked slowly. A few clothes, my laptop, a framed photo of my mom, and a notebook I hadn't written in for months. Downstairs, I heard Elias moving around. The soft rhythm of footsteps, the faint click of a kettle. When I went to the kitchen for water, he was leaning against the counter, wearing a dark sweatshirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Settling in okay?" he asked. "Yeah, it's quiet here. You'll get used to it." Something in the way he said it told me he wasn't talking about the neighborhood. Dinner was an awkward dance of politeness. Me offering to cook, him refusing, ending with 2 separate meals and an agreement on labeled shelves in the fridge. But later, when I passed through the living room, I noticed he'd left a spare blanket folded on the couch for me, just in case the radiator upstairs wasn't enough. I didn't thank him. Somehow, the gesture felt private, like a language he didn't want translated out loud. That night, lying in the narrow bed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards made me think of footsteps. The city noise I was used to, sirens, laughter, the constant hum, was replaced by a kind of silence that felt alive. Then I heard it, soft at first, a faint crackle, then the warm hiss of vinyl. Music. A record player somewhere downstairs, playing something old and slow. The kind of song you didn't dance to, but remembered someone through. I couldn't make out the lyrics, only the melody, nostalgic, tender, maybe sad. I imagined Elias sitting alone in the living room, eyes half closed, one hand around a cup of tea or whiskey, and for a strange moment, I felt something loosen inside me. Not attraction yet, but recognition. The quiet ache of another person trying to make peace with the ghosts in their house. I turned toward the wall, listening until the song faded into the soft static of the record's end. When I finally drifted off, the last thing I remember was thinking that maybe, just maybe, this house wasn't as lonely as it seemed. The first few mornings felt like learning a new language made entirely of silences. Elias and I shared the kitchen like strangers forced into an uneasy truce. One person stirring coffee while the other pretended to check their phone. The routine was careful, efficient, and strangely comforting. He'd be up first, always, and by the time I shuffled in half awake, there'd already be a mug waiting near the stove. No note, no words, just coffee, dark, strong, and quietly deliberate. I never asked if it was for me, but it always was. Days slipped into a rhythm. I found a temporary job at a used bookstore downtown, minimum wage, but enough to feel useful again. The commute took 40 minutes, and when I came home in the evenings, the house was the same. Lamps dimmed, shoes neatly aligned, that faint smell of cedar and soap. Elias didn't talk much, but he noticed things. If I left a jacket on a chair, it would be hung up the next morning. When the faucet in my bathroom began to drip, I mentioned it offhand. By the time I came home the next day, it was fixed. "You didn't have to," I started when I saw the replaced washer and the tools neatly arranged. He just shrugged. Didn't take long. That was Elias, a man of actions instead of explanations. I started watching him when he wasn't looking, the way he rubbed his thumb against his palm when thinking, the quiet sigh he gave before turning off the lights every night, the untouched corner of the bookshelf, where a layer of dust had gathered on a photograph of the same woman from the mantel. She looked kind, maybe tired, maybe loved once. I never asked. Some stories announced themselves without being told. One evening after work, I came home to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. The air smelled of wet pavement and something earthy. Elias was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, rinsing dishes. He glanced over when I entered. "Storm's getting worse," he said. "Might lose power." I nodded, setting down my damp bag. "Guess I'll light a candle if it happens." He smirked slightly. "There's a box of them in the drawer. Learned the hard way last year. This neighborhood's power grid hates thunder." Minutes later, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then darkness swallowed the house. We stood there in silence, the sound of rain louder now that everything else had gone quiet. Elias reached into the drawer without fumbling, like he'd done this 100 times, and soon the soft glow of a candle illuminated the room. Warm, amber light brushed across his face, catching the faint stubble on his jaw and the tired lines around his eyes. He handed me one. There. Now we won't trip over each other. Thanks, I said, though my voice came out too soft, almost reverent. We ended up sitting at the small dining table. 2 candles between us, rain thrumming outside. The world beyond the windows felt erased, leaving only this room, this moment. I used to like storms, I said finally, breaking the silence. When I was a kid, my mom and I would sit by the window and count seconds between lightning and thunder. He smiled faintly, the expression barely visible in the flickering light. How many seconds meant you were safe? 5. Anything less, and she'd say we had to hide under the blanket. Even when I was too old for it. Sounds like she cared. She did. I just wish she'd been around longer to keep proving it. He looked down, the flame reflecting in his eyes. She's gone. I nodded. 3 years now. There was a pause, not awkward, just heavy with understanding. My dad's gone too, he said quietly. Different kind of storm, though. Something in his tone made me think he didn't just mean death. We talked for the first time, really talked, about nothing and everything. Music, books, places we'd lived. How strange it felt to grow older and realize the adults you depended on were just improvising too. At one point, I asked about the records he played at night. They sound old, I said. They are, he replied. Most of them belonged to my ex-wife. The word hung there like a chord that wouldn't resolve. He didn't elaborate, but I didn't need him to. The way his fingers brushed the rim of his mug said enough. She liked jazz, he continued after a moment. The kind that sounds like smoke and regret. I never understood it, but I kept the records after she left. Why? He hesitated. Because some things don't stop meaning something just because the person does. I swallowed hard. That's true. He gave a small laugh, dry but not cruel. Sorry. That sounded heavier than I meant it. No, it's fine. I get it. For a few seconds, all I could hear was rain and the low hum of wind against the windows. The candlelight softened everything. The walls, his features, even the air between us. I noticed then how different he looked like this. Relaxed, almost gentle. The hard edges of his voice smoothed by warmth and flickering light. I caught myself staring too long, and he caught me catching myself. What? He asked, voice calm, maybe curious. Nothing, I said quickly. Just, you seem different when you talk about her. He raised an eyebrow. Different how? Human, I said, then instantly regretted it. He laughed. A real one this time, low and brief. Good to know I usually come off as something else. You do? I said, smiling in spite of myself. Like a fortress. His expression softened. Fortresses don't last forever. They just wait until someone stops trying to break them. We both went quiet again after that. But the silence felt different now. Less like distance, more like space. The storm outside grew louder. A branch scraped against the siding. Somewhere a shutter banged loose. Elias stood and walked to the window, checking the latch. His movements were unhurried, assured. The candlelight followed him, casting tall shadows that danced across the room. He turned back toward me. You should get some sleep before the power comes back. Yeah, I said, though I didn't move. Thanks for the talk. He nodded once. Anytime. Our eyes met for just a second longer than necessary. Then he blew out the candle. Darkness again. But this time it didn't feel cold. Upstairs, I changed into a t-shirt and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and through the thin walls, I heard Elias moving around. The faint creak of floorboards, a door closing, then the scratchy hiss of a record beginning to play. Same one as before, I thought. The same song. Only now, the sound didn't make me lonely. It made me feel seen. Like we were both keeping each other company from different corners of the same sadness. When I finally lay down, the candlelight still flickered faintly under the door, and I realized I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. Maybe some silences don't need to be filled. Maybe they just need to be shared. The first chill of winter arrived quietly. One night it was just cold enough to make the air sting when I exhaled. The old radiator in my room groaned like it was arguing with itself, rattling uselessly before giving up entirely. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets, but by midnight the cold had settled deep, crawling beneath the layers. I could see my breath in the dark. The window glass had a thin film of frost, and I pressed my palm against it just to feel something warmer than the sheets. Downstairs, I could hear Elias moving. His footsteps were soft, measured, the same rhythm I'd come to recognize in the weeks we'd lived together. I hesitated before calling out. It was late, too late for anyone to be polite, but the cold was winning. Elias! My voice cracked in the quiet. A door opened. You okay? Sorry, I said, teeth chattering a little. My heater stopped working. I think it's frozen or something. He appeared at the top of the stairs, hair a little messy, wearing an old sweater that looked softer than anything I owned. It's an old system, he murmured. Sometimes the upstairs line shuts off in winter. I should have checked it. It's fine. I'll survive. He frowned. You won't. Not in this cold. Before I could argue, he turned and said simply, Come downstairs. You can crash in my room for the night. I froze. No, really, I don't want to. Jamie. His tone was firm but not unkind. Just for the night. You'll freeze up there. The way he said just for the night felt like an oath, a promise that this wasn't about anything but warmth and care. Still, my stomach flipped. I grabbed my pillow and followed him down the stairs. His room was what I'd imagined but never seen, minimalist like the rest of the house, but lived in. A small bookshelf, a nightstand with a glass of water, one framed photo face down. The sheets were dark gray, rumpled, the air faintly carrying the scent of cedar soap and something warmer, him. He gestured toward the bed. It's big enough. I'll stay on my side. Are you sure? Positive. I nodded, setting my pillow down like a visitor setting foot in holy ground. Okay, just for tonight. He gave a small, crooked smile. Just for tonight. The first few minutes were torture. I lay stiff as a board, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe too loudly. The bed dipped slightly with his weight beside me. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of the furnace vent and the wind brushing against the window. It had been years since I'd shared a bed with anyone. Longer since it had meant anything beyond proximity. I could feel the warmth radiating from his side, seeping slowly toward me, filling the cold spaces my blankets had failed to. The scent of him was faint but distinct. Soap, old cotton, the trace of coffee that seemed permanent in his skin. He turned once, the sheets whispering against themselves. Are you warm enough? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah. Thank you. Try to sleep. I wanted to laugh as if either of us would. Minutes stretched. My heartbeat was embarrassingly loud in my ears. I tried to focus on anything else. The faint crack in the ceiling, the rhythm of the wind, the clock ticking somewhere beyond the door. But then his arm shifted, brushing lightly against mine. Just skin, just warmth, but it felt like a voltage through the cold. I froze. So did he. Then, carefully, deliberately, he moved his arm back to his side. The air between us hummed. Not intention, not quite, but awareness. I stared at the ceiling, eyes open wide, feeling ridiculous and vulnerable and 17 again. Every nerve felt awake. Every breath felt shared. After what felt like hours, I whispered, Do you ever miss it? His voice came back, low and half asleep. Miss what? Having someone there, beside you. There was a pause, long enough that I thought maybe he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, every night. The honesty in those 2 words made something ache in me. I turned slightly, just enough to see the faint outline of him in the dim light spilling from the hallway. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling like it might answer questions neither of us had the courage to ask. I got used to silence, he said quietly. But used to doesn't mean happy. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I'd been sleeping beside emptiness long before my bed ever got cold. But my throat tightened instead. Yeah, I murmured. Used to doesn't mean happy. Our eyes met in the dark, brief, hesitant, but enough. The furnace clicked again, sending a rush of warm air through the vent, and I felt him exhale slowly beside me, like he'd been holding his breath too. I shifted slightly closer. Not enough to touch, just enough to share the heat. He didn't move away. The silence between us changed shape, growing heavier but not uncomfortable. There was something fragile about it, like the quiet between notes in a song you don't want to end. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. You don't have to stay long here, you know? Once you get back on your feet, you can find somewhere better. I turned my head toward him. Maybe I don't want somewhere better. He didn't reply, but I saw the faint curve of a smile before he rolled onto his side, facing away. I lay there, staring at the back of his neck, the small curl of hair that brushed against his collar. I could see the steady rise and fall of his shoulders, hear the soft rhythm of his breathing. It was innocent, but it wasn't simple. I wanted to reach out, not out of desire, but to prove something existed between us that wasn't just circumstance. A warmth that asked for nothing in return. But I didn't, because safety, I realized, can feel dangerous too. Not because it hurts, but because it tempts you to hope again. Sometime after midnight, I finally closed my eyes. I didn't sleep much, only drifted between dreams, memories of cold apartments, nights of silence, and now this, the quiet pulse of another life beside mine. When I woke, pale light filtered through the curtains. Elias was gone, but the sheets on his side were still warm. On the nightstand, a folded note rested against a steaming mug. Heaters fixed, coffees on the counter. I stared at the handwriting, careful, neat, a little formal. Then I smiled, small but real. Maybe just for the night was how it started. But somewhere between the silence and the warmth, the night had already stretched into something longer. The morning after the heater night felt like walking into a room where someone had moved all the furniture an inch to the left. Everything looked the same, but nothing fit quite right anymore. Elias was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, dressed for work in his usual dark jacket, a mug in his hand. The air smelled of coffee and toast, but the silence between us was louder than the kettle's whistle. "Morning," I said. My voice cracked in the middle. He nodded. "Morning. Heaters fixed. Shouldn't give you trouble again." "Yeah, I saw the note. Thanks." That was it. No mention of the night before, the shared bed, the conversation, the quiet that had felt like more than quiet. Just two people pretending nothing had happened. We moved around each other like careful dancers, never too close, never too casual. The coffee mug he used stayed on the far side of the counter. I poured mine on the other. When our eyes met, one of us always looked away first. By the time he left for work, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. Cold night, a shared space, simple kindness. Almost. Days fell back into routine, the same rituals, only sharper now. Every gesture felt loaded, every silence suspicious. I started trying too hard. I cooked dinner some nights, cleaned the kitchen before he came home, fixed the loose cabinet hinge he'd ignored for weeks. When I caught him noticing, I'd pretend I hadn't seen the small smile tugging at his mouth. It was my way of keeping things normal, of proving that I hadn't crossed a line, even though my heart already had. The small betrayals of our self-control came quietly. Once, we reached for the same glass in the cupboard and our fingers brushed. Nothing dramatic, just skin against skin, a pulse of heat. Another night, he came home late, rain dripping from his hair, and I handed him a towel before realizing I was still holding it after he took it. We both laughed, short, awkward, nervous. He said, "You don't have to take care of me." I wanted to say, maybe I want to, but I didn't. Instead, I joked, "Consider it rent payment." His answer was quiet. "You've already paid enough." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't exactly comfort either. It was something that lived in the narrow space between the two, where meaning hides when neither person is ready to say it aloud. That week, I got a rejection email from another job application. The kind that begins with, "We appreciate your interest, but shouldn't have hit me that hard." It wasn't even my dream job. But it was late, I was tired, and the words blurred until they didn't look like rejection from a company. They looked like rejection from the world. I sat at the dining table, staring at the glow of my laptop screen, tears blurring the text. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, to blink it away, but it kept coming. That ache that starts small and then spills everywhere before you can stop it. I didn't hear Elias come in. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway, keys still in his hand, eyes catching the faint light of the screen. "You okay?" he asked softly. I wiped my face fast, but it was useless. "Yeah, just..." My voice cracked again. "Just one of those days." He walked over slowly, like he wasn't sure if I'd let him close. "Bad news." I nodded. "Another rejection. Feels like I'm running out of versions of myself to sell." He didn't say anything, just stood there, the room heavy with quiet sympathy. Then, without asking, he sat down beside me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he placed a hand on my shoulder. Steady, solid, grounding. Not a hug, not a rescue, just presence. And somehow that was worse or better, because it broke something open inside me that words never could. We sat like that for what felt like forever. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rain outside. I could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of my shirt, the small weight of care behind it. He didn't pull away and I didn't lean in, but we both knew something was shifting, something that couldn't be undone. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're trying too hard to hold it all together." "I have to," I said, my throat tight. "If I stop, I don't know what's left." He nodded slowly, his thumb moving once, almost absently, against my shoulder. "You'd still be you. That's usually enough." I laughed weakly, tears mixing with the sound. "You really think so?" He gave a small smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes but still felt real. "Yeah, you're a good person, Jamie." The way he said my name, low, careful, made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't good, that I'd been thinking about that night too much, that every time I walked into a room where he'd been, the air still felt charged. But the words stayed behind my teeth, because what if saying them broke everything? Eventually, he stood. His hand lingered on my shoulder for one last second before he pulled it back. "Eat something," he said quietly, "and get some sleep. The world looks less cruel in the morning." He left the room before I could answer. The door clicked softly behind him, and I sat there in the candlelight of my screen, staring at where his hand had been. It was strange, how one small act of comfort could feel more intimate than anything I'd ever known. The days that followed were quieter than ever, but something had changed in the silence. He started leaving small things again, coffee in the morning, a slice of toast already buttered. I started cooking dinner again without asking if he'd eat. We never mentioned the night in his bed or the moment at the table. But sometimes, when I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye, there was a softness there that hadn't been before, like he was trying to unlearn the habit of keeping people out. And I was trying not to hope. One evening, I walked past his room and saw the faint glow of lamplight spilling through the crack in the door. He was sitting at the edge of his bed, reading something, brow furrowed. For a second, I thought he might look up and catch me watching. He didn't, but I realized then that I didn't need him to, because what I wanted more than an answer, more than a confession, was just this, the quiet knowing that maybe, in some small way, I mattered here, that I had become part of his silence. And that silence, I was learning, could be its own kind of love. The wind came back that week, carrying the kind of cold that made the house sigh in its bones. I lay awake in my room, watching shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the radiator mutter uselessly. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed moments that weren't supposed to matter. His hand on my shoulder, the quiet in his voice, the way he said my name like it meant something worth keeping. Sometime after midnight, I gave up pretending. I pulled on a sweater and padded downstairs, careful with each step. The house was dim except for a faint golden glow from the living room. Elias sat on the couch, one hand cradling a mug of tea, the other pressed against his forehead. He didn't look surprised to see me, just tired in a way that made me want to sit beside him before I even knew why. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. You either. He gave a small shrug. Old habit. Nights have a way of remembering what the days forget. I eased down onto the far end of the couch. The space between us felt like a line drawn in chalk. Easy to erase, dangerous to cross. What are you remembering tonight? I asked quietly. He stared into the steam rising from his mug. Too much, too little. Depends on how honest I feel. I waited, not pushing, letting the silence breathe. Finally, he said, when my wife left, I thought I'd built my life to be steady. But steadiness isn't the same as being alive. After she left, I filled the house with quiet. Thought if I stayed still enough, nothing else could break. I traced a pattern on the couch cushion with my thumb. Did it work? He looked up at me then, eyes soft, unguarded. Not really. It just made the emptiness easier to schedule. We both laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that hurts but helps at the same time. I know that feeling, I said, when you start measuring your life in chores and meals and hours. Like if you keep moving, you won't notice what's missing. He nodded, setting the mug down on the coffee table. You get it more than most people your age should. Guess I'm an overachiever in all the wrong subjects. For a while we just sat there, the clock ticking, the wind rattling the windows. Something about the night made honesty feel less dangerous. Elias leaned back, head against the couch. You've made this place feel different, you know? Quieter but not lonely. I'd forgotten that could exist. I swallowed hard. Different good? Or different inconvenient? His mouth curved faintly. Different needed. The words settled between us like the last piece of a puzzle. I wanted to say something back, but every version sounded too fragile, too loud. My heart was beating fast, too fast, and my throat felt tight. He turned toward me then, eyes steady. It's been years since I've let anyone close, he said, the confession simple, almost weightless. But you feel like something I forgot I needed. The air left my lungs in a rush. I didn't know what to do with the ache that rose up. Part relief, part fear. I don't know what to say, I admitted. Then don't. He reached out, slow enough for me to move away if I wanted. I didn't. His hand brushed the side of my face. Careful, trembling. It wasn't a question, it was permission. I closed my eyes, just breathing him in soap, tea, and that familiar trace of cedar. When I opened them again, he was closer. Close enough that I could see the tiny scar near his lip, the tiredness that made him human, not distant. I don't want to ruin anything, I whispered. You won't, he said, voice almost breaking. There's nothing left to ruin, just things worth rebuilding. The first touch of his lips was tentative, a breath more than a kiss. Neither of us moved for a heartbeat. Then he leaned in just enough for it to become real. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't claim. It was recognition. Two people remembering what it felt like to be seen. My hands trembled as they found his shoulders. He let out a shaky exhale, the sound half relief, half disbelief. We stayed like that for a long time, no urgency, just stillness and warmth. When he finally pulled back, our foreheads rested together, both of us trying to remember how to breathe. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said quietly. Neither did I replied. But I'm not sorry. He smiled, small, almost hidden. Me neither. After that, words seemed unnecessary. He reached for the blanket draped over the back of the couch and tugged it around us, the motion unspoken, instinctive. I leaned against him, feeling the weight of his arms settle across my shoulders. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but in here, everything felt warm and slow. For the first time in months, my heartbeat matched someone else's. He didn't try to make promises, and I didn't ask for any. The silence between us wasn't avoidance anymore. It was trust. His thumb traced lazy circles against my arm. You should sleep, he murmured. I can't. Then just stay. So I did. I felt his breathing slow beside me, steady and deep. The tension I'd been carrying since the day I moved in began to loosen, piece by piece. I thought of all the nights I'd spent alone in this house, listening to the same records through the walls, wondering who Elias really was. Now I knew, not through stories, but through the quiet kindness of his presence. He wasn't a fortress. He was a man who'd been waiting too long for someone to knock and stay. At some point, the heater clicked off again, but it didn't matter. The warmth between us was enough. I drifted in and out of sleep, my head against his shoulder, his fingers absently brushing through my hair. Each small movement felt like a sentence neither of us could say aloud. When I stirred, the first light of morning was filtering through the curtains. Elias was still there, half asleep, the faintest smile on his face. I didn't move. I didn't want to break the spell. For once, it felt okay to stop pretending that safety and love were two different things. Sometimes I thought safety is love, the kind that doesn't demand, doesn't perform, just stays. And as the light grew brighter, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, it would be real. Spring came quietly, the kind of season that doesn't announce itself but simply replaces what was broken with something living again. The air softened. The sun stayed longer in the windows. And the house, that old, quiet house, no longer felt like someone's shelter. Felt like home. It had been months since that night on the couch. We never talked about it as a confession or an event. There was no dramatic "what are we now?" conversation. Things simply unfolded. The same routines, the same rooms, only warmer now, gentler. My books had migrated to the living room shelf, squeezed in between his collection of poetry and old war memoirs. My favorite mug sat beside his on the counter every morning. His chipped one that said "World's Okayest Cook" and mine, plain blue and new. My jacket lived on the back of the chair he never scolded me for using. It wasn't sudden, but one day I realized I'd stopped asking if I was intruding. We built our days quietly. He woke first, always, making coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I'd stumble in a few minutes later, hair sticking up, eyes half closed, and he'd slide a mug toward me without a word. Sometimes I'd find him at the kitchen window, watching the street with that soft stillness I'd come to know, the way he seemed both present and elsewhere. I'd rest my chin on his shoulder, and he'd reach back to touch my hand without turning around. In the evenings, I cooked while he set the table. He never followed recipes. I never measured ingredients. Somehow it worked. We didn't talk much while eating. Not because we had nothing to say, but because quiet had become our language. The silence that used to feel like distance now felt like peace. Friends started noticing changes. A coworker from the bookstore came by one Saturday with extra pastries and asked, "So, your landlord's cool with you taking over his kitchen like this?" I'd laughed, glancing at Elias, who was in the backyard fixing the fence. "Yeah," I said. "He's cool with it." Neighbors waved when they saw us together. Two men carrying groceries, trimming hedges, arguing about what color to paint the porch. They probably thought we were just roommates. Maybe they whispered, maybe they didn't. We didn't care. The truth didn't need to be declared. It just needed to be lived. One evening, we sat outside watching the sky turn from blue to honey to gray. The world smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. I rested my head against his shoulder, the wood of the porch cool beneath us. "Do you ever miss before?" I asked. He tilted his head slightly. "Before what?" "Before me. Before all this." He took a slow breath. "Sometimes I miss the quiet I used to mistake for peace. But not enough to want it back." I smiled at that, the kind of smile that hurts a little because it means something real. He continued, "You filled this place with sound again. Laughter. Clutter. Bad music. Hey!" He grinned. "Mostly good music. Mostly." We both laughed, and I leaned into him. The rhythm of our lives had become something steady and tender. No fireworks, no big declarations. Just belonging. Inside, the old record player still sat in its corner. The same one that had kept us company when we were strangers separated by walls. Some nights, he'd put on one of those jazz records his ex-wife left behind. I'd tease him about it, call it melancholy for the middle-aged. And he'd shake his head, pretending to be offended. But sometimes, when the room was dim and the record crackled, he'd pull me closer. Slow, wordless, the kind of dance that doesn't need rhythm. No one was watching, and that made it perfect. There were days when life outside tried to intrude, bills, deadlines, the small frustrations of being human. We argued once over something stupid, like whether to replace the old couch or not. I stormed off, slamming the door to the guest room that hadn't been mine for months. He let me cool down. Hours later, I found a cup of tea outside the door and a note that simply said, "This house is big enough for both our tempers. Don't freeze yourself out again." We laughed about it the next morning. We always did. That's the thing about love born from quiet. It doesn't demand perfection. It just asks you to stay. By summer, we'd built a small garden in the backyard. I'd never cared for plants before, but he said tending something that grows teaches patience. On Sundays, we'd kneel in the dirt side by side, hands dirty, forehead sweaty, complaining about weeds that came back no matter what. "Maybe they're just stubborn," I said once, yanking one from the soil. He smiled. "Maybe they just don't know where else to belong." And I thought, neither did I until here. Months blurred, as good days tend to do. We took small trips, weekend drives to the coast, an antique shop he loved, a roadside diner that served awful coffee but perfect pancakes. We never needed to go far. The best parts of the world seemed to exist right where we stood. One night, lying in bed, I caught him staring at me the way he used to stare at the world when he thought no one noticed, soft, wondering, grateful. "What?" I whispered. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just still getting used to this. Not wanting to wake up alone." I reached for his hand beneath the blanket. "Then don't." He didn't. Time didn't erase the loneliness we'd both come from. It just made it smaller, quieter, easier to carry. Some nights he still woke from dreams he wouldn't describe, sitting at the edge of the bed until his breathing evened. I'd reach out and touch his back, and he'd settle again, no words needed. We didn't fix each other. We just stopped pretending we didn't need to be found. One morning, months later, sunlight spilled across the room. Warm, golden, alive. I woke first for once. Elias was still half asleep beside me, hair messy, the kind of unguarded that only happens when you've stopped fearing the day. I turned toward him, smiling. "You snore," I whispered. He cracked one eye open. "I do not." "You do." Quietly, like a bear that's embarrassed to be a bear. He laughed. A low, sleepy sound that made the room feel softer. "You're impossible." I leaned in. "And yet, here I am." He shifted onto his side, tracing the edge of the blanket with his fingers. "You know," he said after a moment, "you never did pay rent again." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? You're bringing that up now?" He grinned. "Just noticing. Been months. Not a single payment." I pretended to think about it. "Guess I'm paying in something else." "Oh yeah? What currency is that?" "Coffee, bad jokes, and staying." He looked at me for a long second, the smile fading into something quieter. "That's more than enough." He reached out, brushing his thumb over my cheek. The same gesture that had started everything months ago. Only this time it wasn't hesitant. It was home. As morning light pooled across the sheets, I thought about the first night I'd arrived here. Broke, uncertain, clutching a backpack full of things that didn't matter. I'd rented a room because I needed shelter. I stayed because shelter turned into something else. Elias's breathing deepened again beside me, soft and steady. The record player downstairs was still spinning from last night. A faint, familiar crackle filling the air. I rested my head against his shoulder, letting the warmth of him sink in, letting the house's silence fold around us. He rented me a room when I needed a place to stay. But what he really gave me was a place to rest, inside someone's heart that had been empty for far too long. And maybe that's what love really is, not fireworks, not grand declarations. Just finding the one person whose quiet finally sounds like home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us bring you more heartfelt stories like this one. Now tell me in the comments, do you think love can grow out of simple companionship, the quiet, everyday moments, or does it always need a spark to begin? Your thoughts always inspire the next story.